Hello and welcome to the 71st episode of the Hope Illuminated podcast, your source for the stories, science, and strategy of resilience, mental health promotion, and suicide prevention, where we live, learn, and work. I'm your host, Dr. Sally Spencer-Thomas, and I'm on a life mission to empower communities with solutions that help people overcome isolation and despair and rekindle a passion for living. Each episode, we're joined by international experts to offer real guidance. And welcome. I'm so grateful that you're here. Today, we are having a very important conversation about crisis services for people of color. And I have an incredibly esteemed guest, Vic Armstrong, who I'll introduce in just a moment. But I just wanted to tee up this conversation for the many reasons why it's absolutely important that we have it right now. After centuries of discrimination and brutality, and all kinds of historical trauma, it is no wonder, it is no surprise that many of our communities of color have exacerbated experiences with trauma and distress and despair. More recently, of course, the number of Black people that have been murdered at the hands of police and the subsequent traumatizing videos, trials, and the anti-racist protests that are met with the brutality of the force are also contributing. And then on top of that, of course, we have COVID disproportionately impacting BIPOC communities, in part due to the systemic racism that drives disparities in access to healthcare. So thus, it's not surprising that we have a lot of despair. But there's more to the story. According to the National Healthcare Disparities Report, Black people are more than 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress than white people, and Black Americans with depression are 20% less likely to receive treatment than white people. So there's a huge treatment gap here. And furthermore, when they do reach out, they are really challenged to find a therapist that looks like them. According to the American Association of Psychology, only 1.5% of their members are Black. So we have a number of massive issues here that we're facing. And also incredible resilience in these communities, both at the individual level and the communal level. Tremendous creativity in working around some of these challenges. And also, let's be real, a lot of fatigue. So in the show notes, I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot of different resources today, and I'm going to make sure to drop some in. I just wanted to highlight a couple that I thought were really promising and creative to support Black people's mental health in particular. One of them is called the Safe Place app, and it really validates the many reasons why racism impacts mental health, but it also offers a lot of self-care tips. There's also what was called the Black Therapy Love app, and it's really to help Black people find a Black therapist without a bunch of hunting and pecking. And then finally, one of my favorite resources is the Ourselves Black. It's a mental health online magazine that's it's got a ton of creative content in it, stories, photojournalism. It's very inspiring, again, collecting the Black community together to face these challenges together. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my friend. Vic and I came to know each other through a number of shared circles of advocacy over the years. The American Association of Suicidology, the National Council on Behavioral Health, RA International, and so forth. And we kind of knew of each other and about each other for a long time before we actually formally met. And it was kind of a special day. We were not even in the United States, we were in Rotterdam in the Netherlands at the Zero Suicide Summit. And we were like, yay, it's a special day. We finally got to meet each other. And that was 2018. Today, he's calling in from Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'll just do a little bit of his formal bio here. He joined the North Carolina Department of Health and Human Services as the director of the North Carolina Division of Mental Health Development Disabilities, Substance Abuse Services in March of 2020. So this is a relatively new position. And he's got the responsibility and oversight of the public community-based mental health intellectual and other developmental disabilities, substance use, and traumatic brain injury system in the whole state of North Carolina. Prior to accepting this role, Vic spent 6 years as the Vice President of Behavioral Health with Atrium Health, also based in Charlotte, North Carolina. He has the responsibility there. He had the responsibility for the operations of Atrium's largest behavioral health hospital, Behavioral Health Charlotte. He has served on a number of board of directors, including the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, NAMI, North Carolina, the National Council of Behavioral Health, and RA International. And he's received a number of awards, which I will formally list on the landing page, but with the 2019 Black Mental Health Symposium, Mental Health Advocate of the Year. I am so thrilled that you're here. Vic, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I am so glad to be here. You know, it's funny you mentioned, and we were actually in Rotterdam, I believe.
Yeah.
And I remember I took a picture and I tweeted it out and said I can cross this off my bucket list now.
Yes, it was pretty cool. It's so funny when you get to know people through Twitter and Facebook, and you're posting pictures of your family and your challenges and your celebrations, and you get to know people, but you actually have never met them in person. So yes, it was a very special day.
It was a pleasure, and it has been a pleasure getting to know you since that time.
Yes, likewise. Thank you. Well, tell us a little bit about how you got into this work. What was your journey that brought you into this space?
Yeah, I probably have been in the truly in the suicide prevention space less time than some of my colleagues. I probably came fully into the space maybe 6 years ago. I had, for the bulk of my career, I have worked more of my professional career on the community mental health side. Mm-hmm. So a lot of what I spent time doing was working in communities and working in public health, trying to bridge gaps in services and trying to create resources in communities. And that kind of evolved into me eventually going from working in the public sector to working for a hospital system where I was working for a hospital that was really kind of the hub of behavioral health services for the surrounding community. So it still kind of kept me in that space of doing a lot of working with the community, working with the court system, working with the provider system. But the thing that I think came fully to light to me once I started working in hospitals about 8 years ago was that the biggest focus, that the main thing that hospitals should be doing is preventing avoidable deaths. And I had kind of, worked around the fringes of suicide awareness. And in part, I think because of growing up in a community, in the Black community, where it was not something we talked about a whole lot. It just wasn't something that really resonated with me the same then as it does now. But once I began to look at the work that I was doing, the hospital system, the impact that we were having on the community, and I began to read the stats and look at the data on how many people were dying by suicide in the Black community. I remember it was either 2015 or 2016. I remember the American Association of Suicidology had published on their website that there had been something like 2,700 or so reported Black deaths to suicide in that year. And that 80%, it's like 79.6% or something were Black men. And it just kind of resonated with me that, we talk about all the things that Black people and Black men in particular die from. We talk about deaths at the hand of law enforcement. We talk about high blood pressure. We talk about diabetes. We talk about heart conditions and all those things. We don't talk about suicide. And I began to see that so many people in the Black community were dying by suicide. And then I saw that the rates were trending up, particularly for Black youth. And it just became a passion of mine. And, having grown up a preacher's kid, my father was a pastor for 48 years. And having been socialized in the Black church and really seeing the church as having traditionally been kind of the gateway to the community, I realized that we had never talked about mental health in the church growing up. In all the years that I heard my father or any of his peers preaching, I never heard them talk about mental health. And if mental health was addressed, it was addressed as a negative thing. So, I think those kind of things just stoked my passion. And then the more I got into advocacy work, the more I realized there were not very many people like me that were advocating, that looked like me, that were advocating for suicide awareness and suicide prevention in the Black community. So it just kind of stoked my passion. I think I've always been the type that if I'm going to do something, I want to be all in. And if I'm passionate about something, I want to give it my all. And once I decided this was what I was going to do, it's been full speed ahead since then.
Oh, yes. And for those of you who don't follow Vic on social media, please do. He's well known for a number of things. First of all, Easy Like Sunday Morning is a regular ritual where we get to be with him as he does his weightlifting, and connecting physical health to emotional well-being is an awesome message. He always wears an inspiring t-shirt. He's got one on now. Be there for your strong friend. Check in on your strong friend.
Yeah.
Yes. And just has been like a tireless voice and advocate connecting all these issues together. I neglected to mention, he was also one of our endorsing voices on our men's anthology, Guts, Grit, and the Grind. It's a collection of stories and science and strategy around men's mental health. And we're working real hard to lift up the voices of men of color who often didn't have a community to share these things with, like you're building as well. I want you to talk also a little bit about the Black youth data, because that is a very concerning trend that we're seeing in suicide. I often talk about, like, before, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago or so, that we weren't even really measuring under 10 years old around suicidal thoughts and behavior. We weren't paying attention to it. And now we have lots of concerning data that our very, very young Black boys have increasing suicidal intensity all the way through the teen and young adult years. Can you talk a little bit about what you're noticing and what your thoughts are on what's changing that?
So there are a couple of things. One, I think there's always the question of, is this new, or are we just starting to see the data? Are we reporting it differently? So that's always a question. But again, when I see data that says, and again, growing up, being all my life hearing that Black people don't die by suicide, and then to see data that says for children 5 to 12, Black kids are dying at twice the rate of white kids. That's a startling statistic, which is also something that is very eye-opening when I shared with the community. But I think we also have to consider that things are, I don't know if things are different, but they're kind of culminating. You mentioned early on about some of the things that we've seen play out in the Black community around some of the violence and things like that. And I think part of what we're seeing is the result of complex trauma. So I think that we've, for dating back to sharecropping, Jim Crowism, slavery even, there's always been this kind of complex trauma that people in the Black community have endured. And I think that there's been a tendency for us to always say, we are just resilient people, and we have to be resilient. We just have to be stronger. And we've internalized a lot of that, and we've also imposed a lot of that on our children, and just always told them, you have to suck it up. You have to be strong. And particularly for Black males, oftentimes Black men have been socialized in the past that the way that you navigate this society and the way that you survive is you keep your head down and you keep your mouth closed. And I think over time that has tended to really put a lot of pressure on Black kids. I think the other thing is, and this is interesting because, I mentioned that I grew up in the church, and one of the reasons I was always told that Black people don't die by suicide was because if you take your own life, you go to hell. Nobody wants to go to hell. And that was something that I heard over and over and over. But I also grew up in an era where everybody went to a community church. Everybody went to church on Sunday. And, that's not even that true anymore in the Black community. And for a lot of the young people, if they're attending church regularly, they're attending mega churches, where you can very easily lose yourself. You can get lost in a crowd. And so I think there's more of an isolation, I think, that Black kids are feeling now. You add to that all that we're seeing and doing with social media, where kids can connect much more easily than they have in the past, but they're also connecting differently. Families don't sit down to dinner anymore, and kids don't necessarily play together outside all day anymore. They're sitting in front of computers, they're playing video games, and they're chatting with people through technology as opposed to having that face-to-face interaction. And I think we're seeing the culmination of a lot of those things starting to play out. And I think we're just starting to see now where the Black community is waking up to some of that. But I also think I think part of our challenge too, and I think this is true of our approach to suicidology in general, is that we have to keep in mind that suicide is not the disease. It is the worst outcome of a culmination of a lot of negative things. And I think when we look at what's happening with Black kids, in addition to looking at the rate of suicide, I think we also have to look at the fact that while Black youth only make up about 17% of the population in this country, they make up 40% of the kids in the juvenile justice system, 45% of the kids in foster care. So there are a lot of things that we have in place that are really kind of pipelining our kids, I think, into a lot of poor mental health outcomes. When you start kids out disproportionately in situations like that, I think you're adding to the possibility that they will experience negative outcomes. And I think those kind of things we have to look at, looking at what are some of the root causes. I think we've also done a disservice to Black kids in the way that we diagnose them. Even the fact that Black kids are disproportionately ending up in foster care in the juvenile justice system, a lot of that is, I believe, is because we're missing a lot of the signs of trauma that kids are experiencing. You take a kid in school who's experienced trauma and maybe, exhibiting symptoms of ADHD, particularly, Black boys who may very often their depression or their trauma may look like conduct disorder. And so they get misdiagnosed with conduct disorder or ADHD, what you're actually seeing is trauma. And when you don't address the root causes of that trauma, I think then you further add to that trauma. And they're much more likely to end up with negative behavioral health outcomes.
Oh my gosh, so much there. I have to go back like 5 minutes ago because you had so much content there that I just wanted to underscore a couple of things. So when you were talking about, the internalizing these messages of resilience and you have to be strong and your head down and you just do the right thing, this also shows up in the Black women community. So because one of the very striking findings when we look at the suicide data is that Black women, I say it's as flat as a pancake across the lifespan, always, 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 always. And so we always get asked, like, why is that? What's going on there? And what are our social justice issues is what we don't know for sure because nobody's actually done the due diligence of the research to figure it out, but we can speculate. And often I'll have Black women in my audience who, I had one woman, she raised her hand and she said, honestly, we don't have time. Like we're taking care of our families and our neighborhood and our church and, we're needed. We have a lot of sense of purpose. And then, someone else will raise their hand and say, but make no mistake about it. Like it impacts us. It shows up in other health issues, heart disease, cancer, et cetera, diabetes. So the stress is on us. And it shows up in other health disparities. But that internalization of the strong Black women holding up communities, they talk a lot about how that has brought them the ability to weather hard times, but it's not without consequence.
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to say a little bit about that piece too?
I'll share a personal story with you. My mother, who passed about 5 years ago at the age of 72, was really, she was always one of the strongest women that I had ever known. But she shared with me, and this was after my oldest son was born, but she shared with me that she gave birth to 5 kids. I had 4 siblings. And after each one of them, she shared with me what she went through in the aftermath emotionally. And what she described were symptoms of postpartum depression. And seeking help to her wasn't an option. It was just something that you just had to, your children needed you, your family needed you. So you just had to suck it up and be strong. And I never knew this. And I'm sure my father saw it, but didn't understand what it was. But I'm sure his perspective on that too was, well, we have children to raise. We've got a household here, and you just have to pull yourself together. And I, to this day, I speculate that that's probably why she, died at what I consider to be a young age, at the age of 72. I just think that her, over time, her body just internalizing all of the grief and the pain, not to mention, raising Black children. I think it had an impact on her, but I also think, you touched on the fact that there hasn't been a lot of research done on, at least not from the perspective of Black people. There's been research done on Black people, but not from the perspective of Black people, which I think is one of the challenges that we face in terms of both, the suicide rate and then some of the other challenges we see in really understanding and getting people of color to participate in treatment. You mentioned that, Black people are 20% more likely to report psychological distressors, but 20% less likely to enter into services. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. One is, I think that here's how I the way I explain it to people is like this. If you were to invite me to dinner at your home, and I might be hungry and I may be looking forward to dinner, but if you serve me okra, I don't eat okra. I don't like it. I can't keep it down. I'm not going to enjoy it, and I'm not coming back if that's what you serve at your house. And so for Black people, it's not that we don't necessarily want treatment. I just believe it is difficult for us to engage in treatment the way that treatment is delivered today. One, it's not delivered in our communities. If you were to do heat maps, which I've done in the past, but if you do heat maps of most communities and you look at where the resources are, the hospital systems, the outpatient services, they're not located in Black communities. And so I think for Black men or Black women or children for that matter, they're less likely to engage or initiate treatment in many cases because that treatment is not readily available in their communities. And then once they get into that treatment, we don't have treatment that takes into account the nuances of what it means to be Black in America. If you don't understand my perspective and my trauma, you can't really enter into person-centered treatment with me. And I think that's another issue that we have. You talked about the fact that there are a lack of Black clinicians in the country. And I think that's an issue. And I challenge our health systems. And when I worked at Atrium, I challenged Atrium to do better. And I know this is a long-term fix, but I think that when I look at schools like University of Clemson or Alabama, who are football powerhouses, they can tell you today who's in the 8th grade that's going to play football for them 4 years from now. So why can we not figure out how to look into the communities and find young Black and Latinx people who can be tomorrow's psychiatrists and psychologists and nurture them and create a new group, a new crop of clinicians, so the cultural competency for the Latinx community doesn't mean teaching white people to speak Spanish. It is bringing in someone who understands that culture. I know for myself as a Black man that it would be extremely difficult for me to go into the office of a young, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 20-something-year-old, very competent clinician and say to her, I cry all the time. I don't feel like getting out of bed in the morning and my sex drive is low. That's not a conversation I'm going to feel comfortable having with anyone, much less someone who I think does not relate to my culture, doesn't even understand how that resonates with me as a Black man, doesn't understand what my masculinity means to me, but also who I feel like doesn't value me maybe the same way that she values someone else. And I think those are all challenges that people of color face in initiating treatment.
Whew, just huge. So many important layers to all of these challenges. And I just want to go back because I do feel like there's also an incredible opportunity with the faith communities. You talked
Mhm.
about your background in really kind of appreciating it and kind of seeing your whole journey through that lens of, we might have caused some prejudicial ideas over here, but we also had some protection because we pulled together as a
Yeah.
community back in the day, and now churches have evolved into this other thing. But I really do believe there's still an incredible opportunity, especially in the Black church, to kind of
Yeah.
bridge these conversations. Because when my brother died back in 2004, I was working in a Jesuit university, Regis University in Colorado. So my early days of thinking about suicide prevention were very much focused on, and I'm not Catholic, but because I was in a Catholic institution, my thoughts were very much shaped by thinking about faith and spirituality and faith institutions and their role, and our shared vision, right? These two, mental health and faith communities, have a shared vision of people living full lives, living very engaged lives that better themselves and other people around them. And so we have an incredible opportunity. But historically, we have been very siloed and have been
Mhm.
casting glances aside, like you don't get it, kind of thing. And I just wanted to know if you've had any success in kind of enrolling some of the faith community partners, and just some of your thoughts on that
Yeah, yeah,
opportunity.
yeah. One of the issues that we face in really trying to have conversations about mental health, suicide awareness, suicide prevention in the African American church is because a lot of leaders in the African American church haven't dealt with their own trauma. So that becomes a very touchy subject. And I try to go in and normalize that conversation and help them to understand that that's not really as rare as you would think. There are a lot of people who haven't dealt with their own trauma in large part because and I think particularly in the African American community, a lot of what happened to you as a child, we didn't characterize as trauma.
Mm.
Getting beaten with a switch or an extension cord, for a lot of people that I talked to who grew up in the African American community, that's what grandma did. That's what mom and dad did. But that doesn't make it right. They did the best they could at the time. That doesn't make it right. Dealing with issues of sexual abuse. A lot of times when I talk to faith leaders, the way that they dealt with their sexual abuse is they say, well, God set me free of it. Even leaders who have struggled with their sexuality will decide that they have been delivered or set free from homosexual thoughts. And getting them to understand, first of all, that you don't need to frame homosexuality as evil or wrong is part of your challenge. But then you can't just turn away from who you are, what's happened to you, and feel like that pressure goes away. So a lot of those conversations I have to have individually with faith leaders, but then going in and talking to them collectively to say, look at the stats, look at the data. Our children are dying, and they are now starting to die disproportionately. So we need to address this. Otherwise, we are failing our children. We're failing our families. When you look at the prevalence of mental illness, 1 in 5 people are going to have a mental health diagnosis, and that's regardless of color. You look at the stressors that Black people face, and so realistically, you have people in your congregations who are suffering. And if we are to be a place of healing, then we need to address those things. And so those conversations start to resonate with people. But again, the struggle comes in with what you can share. Um, when I do start to talk a little bit more about some of those things that may have caused some of the trauma within the communities, those things are harder for folks to talk about than talking about the external stressors. When I talk about systemic racism and things like that, everyone's on board. When I start talking about the trauma that we've inflicted within our own communities, that conversation doesn't flow quite as easily. So we still have some challenges there, but there's a huge opportunity because I know that I was raised in the church. I was socialized in the church. The church has been the gateway to the Black community. And not only has the church been our source of socialization and social services and all those things within the community. But the church has also been the mouthpiece that let the external community know what was important to the Black community. And so there's a role, I believe, for the church to play in saying, hey, mental health is important to us. Suicide awareness and prevention is important to us. I try to encourage churches that when you're building out your church calendar for the year, add a mental health Sunday, add some mental health workshops, invite folks from the outward community in to talk about mental health and to provide resources. And I also encourage faith leaders to get educated. I'm not asking you to be a clinician, but I am asking you to understand how to connect people to clinicians and how to connect people to resources. So I do believe there's a huge opportunity there. I think there's also an opportunity to bridge a lot of gaps between different communities. I've done work in traditional churches. I've done some work with, in mosques. I've done some work in synagogues. And every so often you can get all of them together and do something collectively. And so I think that's an opportunity. I think the church can be a way, the faith-based community can be a way of bringing all the communities together around some common goals to address suicide prevention and suicide awareness.
Yeah, I really do love that interfaith approach. I remember, again, back at Regis, we would have a panel of different faith leaders, talking about their faith's perspective on these issues, but then also how they could band together as a united front, saying this matters to the faith communities at large. And there's much that we can do together to help both people coming through suicidal despair, as well as supporting people who have lost loved ones to suicide. So that kind of brings me to the next phase that I'm hoping we have a chance to talk about today, and that is really about crisis services. You talked a little bit about the gap in access in terms of not being in the physical neighborhood, and the gap in access of not having a strong enough pipeline of providers from the cultures. But what are some of the other gaps and opportunities that we have when people are really in the downstream part of the crisis, whether that's, they're right on the brink of attempting, or they have attempted, or they've lost a loved one? What have you noticed about the crisis services in communities of color?
Yeah, first of all, I think that there are a couple of things about that. One is, when I said that there are no, there really aren't community resources in communities of color, what that means is that for most people in communities of color, their introduction to the mental health system is going to be either in the back of a police car or in an acute care ED. And neither of those will be conducive to good outcomes or building a good relationship with the mental health system, which I think that in and of itself means that for a lot of people of color, when they go into mental health crisis, they go to the acute care ED. They either end up committing something that is viewed as a crime or a public nuisance, and they're introduced that way, or they end up in an acute care emergency department. So I think that's the first piece of it, is that I don't see enough resources in the community. And then when there are resources to respond, there is a very heavy law enforcement presence. And I think that even in the best of circumstances, the presence of law enforcement can cause a heightened awareness and can escalate a Black person, in particular a Black man. I do a lot of what we call less talk sessions, and it's basically just bringing people into a space and talking about whatever is topical, and having people, particularly if there are racial tensions and things like that, just to be able to talk through those things openly, and create safe space for those conversations. And I did one of those conversations a couple of years ago, and probably had about 100, maybe 105 people in the room. And I asked how many people, by show of hands in that space, if you were out walking at night on a dark street and a police car pulled up, how many of you would feel more safe? And of course, all the hands of all the white people in the room went up. And so how many would feel less safe? And the hands of all the Black people in the room went up. And so it's something that I don't know that most people, even unless you're a member of the Black community, can wrap your head around, the fact that for Black people, the presence of law enforcement doesn't necessarily make us feel safer. So I think that when you have someone who's in a mental health crisis and the primary response is a law enforcement response, and I mean law enforcement, even if you have a social worker with them, I think that's a challenge. So
even if they're trained in,
even
community
if they're
mental health
CIT
stuff.
trained, and
Right,
I think having officers, I'm a big proponent of CIT training. I've been involved in CIT training for years.
Can you just explain what CIT training is for the people
The
who don't
crisis
know?
intervention training is crisis intervention team training is training law enforcement officers how to respond to someone who's in a mental health crisis. A 40-hour training, and it's a great training. It involves some role play. It actually involves going on site and visiting some settings where people with mental health challenges may congregate or may show up. And it's fabulous training. And I encourage people all the time that if you are dealing with someone in a mental health crisis and you have to call in law enforcement, ask for a CIT trained officer. But it still doesn't change the fact that for someone who's already in a heightened state, when they see a law enforcement officer show up, that escalation just gets worse. And then you're trying to de-escalate someone, and it can become very confrontational because law enforcement officers still, they don't know what's going on. They don't know what to expect. They're trying to make sure they get home at the end of the day. And so it can often lead to poor outcomes. So I think that, again, is part of the challenge that we have a law enforcement response. I think our other challenge is that where we try communities or try pilots where we try to have less of a law enforcement response. So they have a kinder, gentler approach to how we bring people into crisis situations. One of the things that we're just starting to do, and I've seen some very good work around the country where people, I know that RA International does some good work with around some of their crisis models. And one of the things they're starting to look at is, what does what do the demographics look like? So who is getting this kind of gentler model? Are people of color getting when we pilot these better ways of doing things, are people of color getting access to these services, or is it still predominantly white people? And does it still have a heavy law enforcement presence? So I think that's one of the challenges that we have to look at, is the law enforcement presence. Now, the other thing that I would say that I think we need to add to, whether you're talking about folks showing up in an emergency department, jails and prisons, or a facility-based crisis, I just think that the presence of peers is just a huge asset. People with lived experience. I also think, we talked earlier about how there are so few psychiatrists and psychologists and even social workers who are Black or Latinx. And, it takes time to build that resource, but a faster track to getting more people of color involved in treatment is through peers. We can train peers faster than we can train psychiatrists and psychologists. And I think that's an untapped resource. So, I believe part of what can help us, particularly with people of color, is when you add someone who not only has lived experience, but lived experience that mirrors my lived experience because they look like me. I think that's a big piece of what we need to be looking at around our crisis response. But I also think that so much of it is that we need to put more outpatient resources in the community in general. I'm not one of those people that believes the answer to the mental health crisis is more inpatient beds. I think it needs to be more resources in the community. But we need more resources in communities of color. We need more outpatient services, more treatment services in Black, Latinx, Native American communities, so that people can access resources closer to home. I also think that we've looked a lot at integration over the last several years, and we've done in some areas a fair job with integrating behavioral health into primary care and integrating primary care into behavioral health. But I think we need to do a better job of integrating behavioral health into the community. So how do we integrate behavioral health into the church setting, into the YMCAs, into the community setting, so that people can access care where they live, where they're comfortable and where they feel like they have some power. Because even with telehealth resources, which we've seen a huge jump in telehealth resources over the last several months, but when you look at the data, people of color are still not even accessing telehealth at the same rate as white people. And so part of it, I think we've taken a step toward improvement by giving people the ability to access health in their communities. And telehealth is a resource for that. But then again, even with that, the next step is we also have to own that we have some racism embedded in our services and our service delivery system. So there's the putting resources closer to the community. I think trying to take the law enforcement presence out of it, but then I think we also have to go back and really look at what kind of services are we offering. It goes back to my analogy about the okra. Even if you put resources in a community where people can access them, if you're not doing it with some cultural sensitivity and cultural humility, people are still not going to be inclined to access those services.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. That's I love you call the problems out right directly, and then you also say, well, if we did some of these things, some solutions that we can focus on. And one of the things that I have found so incredibly inspiring in this space has been the whole the barbershop communities that have kind of popped up everywhere, because that's exactly what you're talking about. It's peers, absolutely. It's where people are comfortable, it's community, and that kind of creativity, I think will help us get in front of this because, I've heard from, I also work with, a lot of, we call them double jeopardy men who are not going to go to mental health services unless they're dragged there. And in those communities where it's first responder or military or construction, it's the peers. It's the peers that are often the ones that make the difference, even more so than the mental health professionals. In a lot of situations, I hear commonly in all of these different populations that about 80% of the distress can be resolved at the peer level with no costs, no restraint, no moving civil rights, like none of that. Just a presence of a peer who's walked in the shoes can de-escalate a situation really quickly for someone who's feeling like, I don't trust the thing you're offering me. So don't make me go there, at least not on the first pass, try something else. So I love that work. Are there any other things that you're seeing that are giving you hope around these kinds of conversations?
I think one of the things I'm seeing is that, and I think we have we go through these cycles where we have windows of time where I think we are more sensitive to some things than at other times. And I think over time, we tend to sway back to the middle, but we continue to gain progress. So I think we're in a window of time where there is a sensitivity to some of the issues around historic racism and some of the health disparities. And I think that attention that we have, it will probably wane some, but I think that we will continue to gain some momentum in that space. So I think there's more of an awareness to that. And I think that what we're seeing as a result of that is there's a greater opportunity, I think, now for minority and women-led provider organizations to be introduced into the system in a way that they haven't before. I think there's more of a focus on the need for culturally sensitive, culturally aware, culturally appropriate services. And I think there's more of an understanding that we're all kind of on this behavioral health, mental wellness continuum. And I think we're at a place now where people can see themselves on that continuum. It's always been historically that people, and I think it's been true, particularly of the Black community, that we've not been able to see ourselves on that continuum. And so it's always other people who are experiencing mental health challenges. And if they would just do something different, then they wouldn't be facing those challenges. And I think now we're at a place where people can see themselves on that continuum and say, the old adage, there but by the grace of God go I, that people realize, I could see myself now experiencing some anxiety. I can see myself experiencing some depression. With all of the, some of the stressors around even racial tension, I can understand now why, I might need to seek some outside help and have a conversation with someone. So I think that window is there. I think there's a huge opportunity. I work for obviously for state government. And so a lot of my responsibilities is in looking at how do we mitigate the challenges we're seeing around mental health at a community level. And one of the things that I am focused on is how do I bring in more historically underutilized businesses to respond to a lot of what we're seeing in historically marginalized communities. So how can we as a system use Latinx providers, Black providers, women-led providers? If I want to talk to someone, if I want someone to go in and talk to Black women about the challenges that Black women face, who better to do that than a woman? Primarily a Black woman, but if not a Black woman, still a woman who can relate. So I think there's an opportunity for us to realize that we need those really nuanced provider types, and I think we're seeing more that start to emerge.
Yes, I share your hope in the sense because this feels qualitatively different, at least the last couple of months. Where before I would say it was more like what we call the state trooper effect, when the national crises were in our constant media news cycles. We were all having lots of feelings. We were getting up and going to a protest or sharing support. But then as soon as it went into the rearview mirror, everything kind of went back to where it was before.
Yeah.
And what I'm seeing is some structural changes, some more intentionality, some more strategic focus on, all right, we've blown it the last however many times this has happened. Yeah. What should we do differently this time? And so I hope that the momentum continues for sure.
Yeah, you and me both.
Yeah. So I'm going to go back and just kind of recap. This has been so rich, so amazing. I think I've taken like 8 pages of notes here. So it's going to be hard for me to kind of summarize this concisely and just kind of reflect a little bit on it. And then I'm going to come back to you with some final thoughts. So, we started with your backstory of growing up as a preacher's kid, and kind of having this strong sense of what church meant and what faith meant, and finding your way into being an incredible mental health advocate for communities of color, in particular Black communities, but broader than that. And you have become such a bridging voice in so many ways because you work in large scale systems that have been predominantly white and have not been able to see, because people are swimming in their own fishbowl, what some of the access issues are in terms of where the services are, who's doing the services, and what the services are actually happening, that have created a huge gap, a huge barrier. And now we're starting to see more data that is very concerning. So now is the time that we need to get, really enroll communities and put them front and center so that they are helping lead the change. And it's not just well-intentioned white people, but actually people of color that are driving these changes, not just in our mental health systems, but in all kinds of systems and communities all over, so that we can get in front of this by making sure that what we're providing is culturally resonant. So I'm filled with hope right now, because this is probably one of the most comprehensive conversations that I've had. You have thought about this so much in so many levels and so many places that I'm just so grateful that you're here, so that we can kind of share this with my community of leaders and listeners to learn more about your work and what's possible for all of these communities. What are some of your final thoughts?
I think for me, still the overarching theme to everything I do is that when it comes to suicide awareness, suicide prevention, we've not gotten it right in any arena. So, because we're seeing an increase in the Black community doesn't mean we've gotten it right in the white community. We haven't gotten it right in any community. So we have a lot of work to do. But for us to really eradicate suicide, which is a preventable death, it's a robber of life, we have to understand that no matter how you define your community, you are impacted by suicide. If you define yourself as being part of the Black community, suicide is disproportionately taking the lives of our kids. If you're part of the white community, more white people die by suicide than any other race in this country. If you're part of the medical community, we lose one physician to suicide every day. You're part of the military community. We're losing over 20 military veterans to suicide per day. We lost more military veterans to suicide since the Vietnam War than we lost soldiers in the Vietnam War. So it is impacting your community no matter how you define community. And the solution is not a Black issue. It's not a white issue. It's not a medical issue. It's not for the schools to fix. It's going to take a community approach. We have to see it as a public health issue. If we focus on it as a public health issue, we bring all of our resources together, we can put an end to suicide. But we can't look the other way and pretend it doesn't exist anymore. It is in our faces, it is at our door, and it is taking lives. And it's going to take all of us to stop it.
Spot on. That's exactly how I feel as well. This is why we were kindred spirits. Yes, we can no longer say it's all about broken individuals that need some kind of medical treatment. This is a public health, a systems approach with lots of social justice issues underwriting it across all the populations that you mentioned. So thank you so much, Vic. This was so wonderful.
Thank you for having me.
Yes, it's super great. And I know after people listen to this, they're going to want to get in touch with you and they're going to have all kinds of questions. So what's the best way for people to get in contact with you?
The email that you got, my work email, that's probably the better one. My personal email, I just, you may have that one too. My Gmail account, I just don't check that one as often, but my DHHS account, I check all the time. And then, of course, people can message me on Twitter or Facebook or whatever. So that's fine, too.
Okay. I'll put all of those on the landing pages if that's all right.
Absolutely.
And again, I'm grateful to you. I'm grateful to Patty for getting us connected. I'm grateful for Jessica to keep us all organized, for Dave making all the sound great, and to all the listeners who are engaging with our conversations today. If you feel so moved as I have been, please leave a rating and review for this episode, which you can find on all the places that podcasts are aired. I'd also love to know what you think, what works for you in terms of the content, the approach. If you have ideas for people to interview, please go to sallyspencerthomas.com and let me know. It's really important to me that we stay connected. So in closing, open your heart, challenge your thinking, and take action to save lives. Together, we can restore dignity and sustain a passion for living.